The story begins in 1945 in Jersey, as a woman named Grace Stewart wakes up from a nightmare. The war has ended, but her husband Charles, who was fighting in France, has yet to return home. She lives in a large, eerie mansion with her two children, Anne and Nicholas, who suffer from a rare condition that makes them extremely sensitive to light. Due to this, the house remains shrouded in darkness, with heavy curtains covering every window. Recently, about 2 weeks ago, all of the household servants mysteriously abandoned them without collecting their wages or leaving any explanation. One day, 3 new servants, an elderly housekeeper named Mrs. Mills, a gardener named Mr. Tuttle, and a young mute maid named Lydia, arrive at Grace's doorstep, responding to an advertisement she had placed for new help. Grace welcomes them and gives them a strict set of rules. No door must be opened without closing the previous one, and the curtains must always remain drawn to protect the children from the light. Strange occurrences begin happening in the house. Grace hears unexplained noises, whispers, crying, and footsteps coming from empty rooms. Anne, her daughter, insists that she can see and talk to an unseen boy named Victor, who tells her that he and his family are living in the house. Grace refuses to believe her and punishes her for lying. However, Mrs. Mills assures Anne that she believes her and tells her that, in time, her mother will see the truth as well. One day, while sewing Anne's first communion dress, Grace hears a loud noise upstairs. She rushes to investigate, but finds no one. However, she sees a door closing on its own through a mirror. She begins to suspect intruders and starts searching the house, recruiting her entire family to help. But the search yields no results. Determined to rid the house of whatever is causing these disturbances, Grace decides to call a priest for a blessing. She leaves the house, but a thick fog sets in, causing her to lose her way. In the midst of the fog, she suddenly stumbles upon her husband, Charles, standing aimlessly. He looks lost and distant, as if detached from reality. Overjoyed, Grace brings him home. But something about him is off. He barely speaks, and his behavior is detached and melancholic. He stays in bed most of the time, hardly acknowledging his family. Meanwhile, Anne continues to draw pictures of the mysterious people she has seen: Victor, his parents, and an old woman with pale, blind eyes. Grace dismisses her claims until one evening, while alone in a room, the piano starts playing by itself. This eerie event forces her to reconsider that perhaps Anne was telling the truth all along. One day, while cleaning, Grace discovers an old book of photographs and is horrified to realize that the pictures depict the dead, post-mortem photography taken decades ago. Mrs. Mills reveals that these are books of the dead, which people in the past used to capture the spirits of their deceased loved ones. As Grace struggles to make sense of everything, she experiences a terrifying moment. She leaves Anne alone for a brief moment, only to return and find that her daughter has transformed into the old woman from Anne's drawings. Horrified, Grace grabs Anne and shakes her violently, screaming. However, when the veil is ripped off, she realizes it was only Anne all along. Overcome with guilt and fear, Grace begins to question her own sanity. Later, Charles finally speaks, revealing that he knows about Anne's disturbing vision of her mother's violent outburst. He comforts Grace, but then, unexpectedly, he tells her that he must leave. Despite her desperate pleas, Charles disappears into the fog once again, never to be seen again. The next morning, the curtains vanish. Sunlight floods the house, causing the children to scream in agony. Grace frantically searches for the missing curtains, growing more desperate by the second. She even accuses the servants of taking them, threatening them with a gun. Meanwhile, the children escape through the window, searching for their father, but instead, they stumble upon 3 gravestones in the garden. Looking closer, they see the names of Mrs. Mills, Mr. Tuttle, and Lydia engraved on them. As they process this horrifying revelation, they see the three servants approaching them. Terrified, the children flee back into the house, pursued by the ghostly figures of the servants. Grace manages to lock them out and orders her children to hide while she prepares to defend them. However, Mrs. Mills calmly tells her that it's too late. The children hide in a wardrobe, but the doors are suddenly thrown open, revealing the old blind woman. Anne and Nicholas scream in terror. Meanwhile, Grace rushes upstairs and sees a group of people gathered around a seance table. The old woman, now acting as a medium, is asking the children why they refuse to leave. The terrified children scream that they are not dead. At the same time, Grace, in a fit of rage, grabs papers and rips them apart, shaking the table violently. However, to the living, Grace and the children are invisible. The people in the seance only see papers flying and the table shaking on its own. The blind woman then scribbles something furiously, breaking into an eerie trance. As Grace watches in horror, the truth is finally revealed. 2 weeks ago, she smothered her children with a pillow while they slept, before taking her own life. The servants disappeared not because they quit, but because they too had been dead for decades, having died of tuberculosis 50 years earlier. The current occupants of the house are Victor and his family, the real living residents. Grace, in shock, finally accepts the truth. She remembers that after she killed her children, she awoke the next morning, convinced she had been given a second chance to be a good mother, believing her past actions to be nothing more than a terrible dream. But the reality is that they had been spirits all along, unknowingly haunting the living. Victor's family, unable to handle the paranormal activity, decides to move out, leaving the house behind. Grace, Anne, and Nicholas watch from the window as they drive away. A "for sale" sign is placed outside, but Grace whispers to her children that they will never leave, for the house belongs to them. As the film ends, Grace and her children stand together, forever trapped in the realm of the dead, bound to the house they once called home. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Movie Story for more amazing movie recaps. Let us know in the comments which movie you'd like us to cover next. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next one.